Okay, welcome back to Canada Tonight. Let's return to our top story now. U.S. President Joe Biden sat down for an exclusive interview with ABC News anchor George Stephanopoulos. That interview has now aired in its entirety. Steve Futterman was watching it, and she now joins us once again live. So, Steve, let's talk about this. What stood out to you from their conversation?
Well, Travis, two words stood out to me, and they're not going to be good words for Joe Biden: defiant and denial. He was defiant, saying he's going to be the candidate and he's going to win. He was in repeated denial when asked questions about his health. At one point, George Stephanopoulos, and this lasted for a couple of minutes, kept asking him, would you be willing to take a neurological test? Something that many people have urged him to do. Obviously, the question about Joe Biden's acuity, his mental stability right now has come under question after the horrible debate a week ago yesterday in Atlanta. And he just would not say yes. Finally, Stephanopoulos asked him flat out, and he said no. Biden said, I go through a neurology test every single day when I have to deal with the problems of the world. That was his issue with that. And he kept sort of pivoting. When asked about the polls, he said, I don't believe in those polls. He kept basically denying what we're hearing from reports that are, from all we can tell, accurate. He denied that his campaign is suffering right now. He kept saying, at one point he said, I still believe I'm the most qualified and the person best able to beat Donald Trump. Well, the polls just aren't indicating that right now. Could happen in November, but right now they don't look that way. And when asked at one point if he would be receptive if people came to him, leaders of the Democratic Party, and came to him and said, you must step aside, he just wouldn't answer that question. Let's take a listen to a part of the interview where he talked about just his bad night in Atlanta.
It was a bad episode. No indication of any serious condition. I was exhausted. I didn't listen to my instincts in terms of preparing, and I had a bad night.
Now, if this interview took place without the debate, it would be fine, but he was trying to counter the debate. He was trying to counter all the negative fallout from the debate last Thursday. I just don't think he was able to do that. Now, let's listen to him earlier in the day, a more vigorous, a more forceful, a much louder Joe Biden speaking before a campaign appearance in Madison, Wisconsin.
I wasn't too old to create over 15 million new jobs. To make sure 21 million Americans are insured under the Affordable Care Act. To beat Big Pharma, the first one to ever do that, and lower the cost of this to a $35 procedure. Was I too old to relieve student debt for nearly 5 million Americans and grow the economy? Too old to put the first black woman on the Supreme Court of the United States of America?
Bottom line, Travis, if you were having concerns about Joe Biden before tonight, I don't think you're jumping up and down saying, oh my God, he's great, he's fine. You might be a little more calmer than you were a week ago, but this has not really pushed the bar dramatically in the other direction. At least that's my readout right after watching the interview.
Okay, so he says he's staying the course. What is next for Biden
Yes.
and this race?
Well, he has the polls which are not looking good. There's one Wall Street Journal poll saying 80% of Americans feel he's too old to run. And the donors, that's a big issue. When you have an American campaign, money is the lifeblood of the campaign. Donors are beginning to say they're going to pull out of the Biden re-election campaign. They feel it's a lost cause. Let's listen to what one donor said. He said basically he's out.
I think that the dam has broken and that more and more people will come out publicly. I can tell you with certainty that as recently as last Friday and Saturday after the debate, there were quite a few people who felt like it was just an off night. As of today, I can't find anybody, but it's different today, I'm afraid. The ship has sailed.
Now, some lawmakers have urged Joe Biden to drop out publicly. A lot are talking about it privately, but publicly, around 3 or 4. They are low-level people, not big names. But if you have some big names that come out, Nancy Pelosi, Hakeem Jeffries, Chuck Schumer, who say, we love what you've done, you've been a great president, but you must step aside, that's really going to change the dynamics. And we are hearing that Hakeem Jeffries, the top Democrat in the House of Representatives, has called a Zoom meeting for Sunday. What that involves, we don't know. Even if everything goes well for Joe Biden, that debate still exists. And from now until November, Republicans will be playing clips from it. over and over and over again.
You can bet on that. Steve, appreciate it. That is
Thanks, Travis.
CBC's Steve Futterman in Los Angeles. Okay, let's get more on this. And to help us break down Biden's interview with George Stephanopoulos is Frank Cesno. He is a former Washington bureau chief at CNN and a professor at the George Washington School of Media and Public Affairs. Good to see you. Thanks for being here. Let me get your assessment on this first off, and also how you think this will play.
Well, my assessment is very much what Steve was just going through. There's nothing in this debate that's going to turn the dynamic, the fundamental dynamic that exists now, which is Joe Biden is too old, Joe Biden is not capable, and Joe Biden is going to lose. That seems to be increasingly what's out there among Democrats. The other thing that's out there, and this is a very, very tough thing for Biden and for the Biden campaign, is this is the narrative. This is the story that's driving political coverage in the United States. There's very little coverage of what Donald Trump is saying in his rallies. There's very little coverage of the suspense leading up to his vice presidential pick, or how he's dealing with the Supreme Court case decisions, or his convictions, or anything else. So what's dominating the coverage right now is Biden's capabilities, and there was nothing in tonight's interview that fundamentally will turn that around for him.
Okay, so what's the strategy here, do you think, then?
Well, right now the strategy is desperately getting him out there, putting him in front of as many crowds as they can. Those crowds are all teleprompter-equipped crowds. That's what he's doing. He's reading from a script. He's reading from a teleprompter. That makes it easier. The interview tonight with George Stephanopoulos was unusual because it was 22 minutes. That's what it ran, without a teleprompter. And there we saw, again, raspy voice, sometimes searching for words, trying to complete a sentence. It just won't change the dynamic. So I think, and I'm very sure about this actually, what we heard from Joe Biden tonight, the denial and the insistence that he's the one who can defeat Trump, that strategy and that storyline, which is coming from the campaign in the White House, is on a collision course with the others who are out there now working quietly, from Senator Warner through to many donors who say this has got to change.
So, I mean, obviously, you know, a week is a long time in politics, but this seems to have legs. Is there anything that the Biden team can do to change this narrative? Do you see this carrying through all the way to November? This conversation about the debate?
Yeah, I've covered politics and been really close for a very long time. It is very hard to change a narrative once it takes root. And this narrative existed before the debate, and then the debate really locked it in. So what can the team do right now? Not much. The only person who could really change this narrative is Joe Biden himself. But as we saw tonight, Joe Biden is Joe Biden. Even if he's somewhat better than at the debate, he's still an 81-year-old man who at times looks like he's searching for a word or to complete his sentence. That's just going to be very difficult to imagine how that can help. If he were 20 points up in the polls, it would be a different matter, but he's not. He's 6 to 9 points down in most of the polls, including in the major battleground states. So this is no joking matter anymore, and that's why the questions that have been coming to him, the only place in tonight's interview where he left any wiggle room at all, and George Stephanopoulos asked him multiple times the conditions under which he might reconsider, step down, anything like that. At the end, he said, if the top Democrats came to you and said this could also cost the House and the Senate, would you consider it? And he said, I'm not going to answer that question. Didn't say yes or no, just said he wasn't going to answer the question. I consider that some degree of wiggle room, the way we read between the lines in Washington and in politics these days.
Yeah, and as you said, you know, 22 minutes is not a very long interview. He was also asked, and I know you watched the whole interview, about his mental health and whether or not that is degraded. Tell me about that portion of the interview and whether or not you think that he, you know, really did things to quell concerns about that and that whole narrative, that his mental acuity is not all there.
Right. George Stephanopoulos came at him several times and said, would you take a cognitive test, a neurological test? And the president said, I have a cognitive test every day, meaning being president of the United States. George asked again, have you had a neurological test? And the president said, well, I've been to Walter Reed, I've had physicals, and the doctors have told me I'm fine to be president. He did not answer that question. And very interestingly, Stephanopoulos came around and said, well, do you feel in some ways, physically, cognitively, emotionally, that this very hard job over these last 4 years has diminished you in any way? And the president essentially said no, which is interesting. It struck me because that's actually at odds with the statement, the very public statement the president said in trying to do damage control right after the debate, that, well, I don't debate the way I used to. What the president didn't do is acknowledge, look, I understand that there are serious concerns out there. I understand that I say it was just an episode during debate night, but others are looking at it as much, they're concluding much more than that. Let me explain how I'm thinking, how I'm, he just didn't do it. It was very difficult for him to put together a really complex thought. And so it becomes very difficult to imagine how this dynamic now gets turned around, and as you say, he was asked several times by Stephanopoulos about that cognitive ability and tests, and he declined at every point to go into it in any more detail, and basically said he was not going to have a cognitive test.
Last question, and it's a completely unfair one because I know that you don't have a crystal ball there. How do you think this all plays out?
It's a great question, and no, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not very good at predicting the future. I haven't done so well predicting the present. Right now, it is a very, very challenging dynamic for the President of the United States, and it looks to me that we could be getting close to a place where the dam breaks. If the Pelosi's and the Schumers and his close friend Chris Coons, senator from the state of Delaware, if they start to look at these polls and focus groups, because there are also focus groups that are taking place, very private, they're going to be getting these back. If they start to feel that there's down ballot danger, in other words, it's not just the White House, it's the Senate and it's the House that are put even more at risk because of this, then I think the president is going to get a visit, and we're going to see where this goes when it comes right to his doorstep.
We will all be watching and waiting to see what happens. Frank, appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you. My pleasure.
That's Frank Cesno, the former Washington bureau chief at CNN and a professor at the George Washington School of Media and Public Affairs.